There are things we see only in the dark, things that wait in the corners of our vision, lurking just beyond the edge of the light. We call them shadows, figments of a tired mind, illusions born of restless nights. But sometimes they are more than shadows. Sometimes they watch. Sometimes they wait. Maggie had never been a good sleeper. Since she was a child, she had struggled with restless nights. Her mind always too busy, too crowded with thoughts that refused to quiet down. But in recent months, things had gotten worse. The nightmares came more frequently now, vivid and relentless, leaving her awake and breathless in the dead of night. She felt trapped, caught between sleep and wakefulness, suspended in a terrifying limbo. It was during one of these nights that she first saw him. She had been lying in bed, her body heavy and immobile, her eyes open, but her mind caught in a fog. At first she thought it was just another bad dream, but then she felt it, a presence, cold and suffocating, filling the room like a thick, invisible smoke. She tried to move, tried to scream, but her body would not obey. She was paralyzed, pinned to the bed by some unseen force, and then she saw him. At the foot of her bed, half hidden in the shadows, stood a figure, a tall man, his form indistinct, almost blurry, like an old photograph left in the rain. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, casting a deep shadow over his face, hiding his features in darkness. But she could see his eyes, two glints of light like embers glowing in the dark. He stood there, watching her, his head tilted to one side, as if amused by her fear. Maggie's heart pounded in her chest. She tried to close her eyes to will him away, but he did not move. He just stood there, silent and still, his presence pressing down on her like a weight. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and rapid, the sound of her pulse in her ears. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to move, just a step closer, then another. His movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet on invisible strings. She felt a scream rising in her throat, but it was caught, strangled by an unseen hand. She could only watch as he came closer, closer still, until he was standing right beside her bed. She could see the faint outline of his face beneath the hat, the suggestion of a smile, cold, cruel, knowing. His hand reached out, long fingers stretching toward her, and she felt a coldness spread through her limbs, a darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. And then, she woke up. The room was bright with the first light of dawn, the birds chirping outside her window. She sat up, gasping for breath, her skin damp with sweat. The terror still clung to her like a second skin, the memory of those eyes, that smile, vivid in her mind. She told herself it was just a dream, just a hallucination born of sleeplessness. But in the pit of her stomach she felt a gnawing dread, a sense that it had been something more, something real. She began to dread the nights, to fear the moments when she would drift off and enter that shadowy space between sleep and wakefulness. And each time he was there, the man in the hat, standing at the foot of her bed, watching her with those terrible, glowing eyes. Sometimes he would speak, his voice a low, whispering hiss, saying words she could not understand, words that made her skin crawl and her heart race. Other times, he would simply stand there, his smile growing wider, his presence more oppressive. She tried everything, sleeping pills, meditation, therapy, but nothing worked. The man in the hat was always there, waiting in the darkness, patient and unrelenting. She could feel herself growing weaker, more exhausted with each passing day, her nerves frayed, her mind stretched thin. She started to see him even in the daylight, a shadow out of the corner of her eye, a fleeting glimpse in the reflection of a window. Maggie was not alone in her torment. As she searched for answers, she discovered stories, thousands of them, from people all over the world, people who had seen the same figure, who had felt the same terror. They called him the Hat Man, a dark, sinister presence that appeared in their sleep, that watched them with cold, glowing eyes, that whispered in a language they did not know. The stories were eerily similar. He always appeared during sleep paralysis, that strange, terrifying state when the mind is awake, but the body is still caught in the grip of sleep. The victims described the same sensation, a heavy weight pressing on their chest, a sense of dread, of being watched by something that did not belong in the realm of dreams. And always they saw him, the tall man with the wide-brimmed hat, his face obscured in shadow, his eyes glinting like embers in the dark. Some said he was a demon, a creature that fed on fear and suffering. Others believed he was a ghost, the restless spirit of someone who had died a violent death, now trapped between worlds. There were those who thought he was an alien, a visitor from another dimension, studying them, observing them like insects under a microscope. But no one knew for sure, and no one knew how to stop him. Desperate for answers, Maggie found herself drawn to the darkest corners of the internet, to forums and chat rooms where others shared their encounters with the Hat Man. She read stories of people who had seen him since childhood, who had felt his presence growing stronger, more insistent, with each passing year. Some claimed he had followed them from house to house, city to city, always appearing just at the edge of sleep. One woman, an artist from New York, had painted his face over and over again, trying to capture the terror of his gaze, the malevolent curve of his smile. Her paintings were dark, disturbing, filled with shadowy figures and twisted shapes. She claimed that the more she painted him, the more often he appeared, until one night, he whispered in her ear, and she never painted again. Her final painting was found torn to shreds in her apartment, the word "enough" scrawled in thick, black paint across the canvas. Maggie found a thread that talked about an old, rare book, a collection of accounts of sleep paralysis from centuries ago, hidden away in the library of a small town in Eastern Europe. The book was said to contain rituals, ways to banish the shadowy figure from one's dreams, but it was nearly impossible to find. Desperate, she contacted the librarian, an elderly man who seemed reluctant to talk. After some persuasion, he agreed to send her a copy of the chapter on the Hat Man. When the envelope arrived, Maggie tore it open with trembling hands. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, but she could make out the drawings. Crude illustrations of a figure wearing a wide-brimmed hat, his eyes mere slashes of black ink, his mouth a thin, cruel line. The text described him as an ancient being, a collector of souls, a watcher of the night. It spoke of rituals involving salt, silver, and a mirror, ways to trap him or banish him back to the darkness from which he came. That night, Maggie followed the instructions to the letter. She sprinkled a circle of salt around her bed, placed a silver coin under her pillow, and positioned a small handheld mirror on her nightstand facing outward. She lay down, her heart pounding, her mind racing with fear and hope. She did not know if it would work, but she had to try. The hours ticked by slowly, the room growing darker, the shadows lengthening. She felt herself drifting, her eyelids growing heavy, her body sinking into the mattress. And then, she felt it, the cold. That same familiar cold that crept into her bones, that made her breath catch in her throat. She opened her eyes, and there he was, the Hat Man, standing at the foot of her bed, his eyes burning with an unnatural light. But this time was different. He seemed hesitant. He looked at the circle of salt, at the mirror on the nightstand, his expression shifting from amusement to something darker, something like anger. He reached out, his fingers curling like claws, but he could not cross the line of salt. He snarled, a low, guttural sound that sent a shiver down Maggie's spine. She grabbed the mirror, holding it up toward him. "Go back," she whispered, her voice trembling but defiant. "Go back to where you came from." The Hat Man recoiled, his form blurring, shifting, like smoke caught in a wind. His eyes narrowed, his smile fading. For a moment, she thought it was working, that he was fading, retreating into the shadows. But then, his face twisted into a grin wider than she had ever seen, his eyes flaring with an intense, burning light. The mirror in her hand shattered, the pieces scattering across the floor like shards of ice. The salt circle began to hiss and sizzle, dissolving before her eyes. The Hat Man stepped forward, his laughter a deep, hollow sound that echoed through the room. Maggie's scream caught in her throat as he leaned in close, his breath cold against her cheek, his eyes locking onto hers. "I will always be here," he whispered, his voice like a rustling of leaves, a hiss of steam. "Always, watching." And then, in an instant, he was gone. The room was silent, still, the morning light creeping through the curtains. The shattered mirror lay on the floor, the salt circle now just a damp ring on the carpet. Maggie sat up, her heart racing, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. She was awake, she was alive. But she knew he would be back. Because some shadows never leave. They just wait, biding their time. Watching from the corners of our vision, from the darkness of our minds. And when the night comes, when we are most vulnerable, they step forward, a little closer, a little clearer, until we cannot tell where the dream ends and the nightmare begins. So if you find yourself waking in the dead of night, feeling the weight on your chest, the cold in the air, and you see a figure at the foot of your bed, wearing a wide-brimmed hat, don't look into his eyes. Don't listen to his whispers, because the Hat Man is watching, and he is always waiting.